Before we step into this compelling piece of history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell.
You cannot
You
escape
will not
this.
want to miss
We
the
had no
surprising
choice.
turns
The
awaiting you in this
circumstances were
authentic
dire.
account of
You
authority,
chose wrong.
defiance, and moral awakening in the pre-Civil War South. Morning mist wrapped around the cypress trees like echoes of Louisiana's
Madam, I
forgotten
bring
souls,
urgent news.
draping
What is
Belmont
it?
Plantation
There are
in an
whispers of
otherworldly
rebellion.
haze that
I
seemed to
see. We
murmur
must
of
act.
mysteries better kept hidden. The date was 1847, and the magnificent property sprawled across countless acres of rich delta earth, its white columned manor standing as a testament to riches amassed through the forced labor of enslaved people.
My dear, you must understand the
Melanie
gravity
Darcy
of this
stood near the
decision.
tall windows
I
of
do,
her
but it
deceased
feels so
husband's
heavy
office,
on my heart.
now belonging to her through the rights of widowhood. At 38 years old, she carried a beauty that grief had refined rather than diminished, prominent cheekbones etched by sorrow, silvery eyes that had mastered the art of revealing no mercy, and raven hair twisted into a tight bun that reflected her unwavering self-control. The dark silk of her mourning attire whispered as she moved away from the window, the noise penetrating the heavy stillness filling the chamber. "Mrs. Darcy," came the tentative voice of Ezra, the elderly house servant who had been with the family for more than 20 years. His worn hands shook slightly as he presented a silver tray holding the morning letters. "The plantation manager requests a conversation regarding the cotton yield, madam." Meline's eyes swept across the men with the cool effectiveness of someone who had come to view individuals as possessions rather than persons. "Inform Mr. Bogart I will meet with him once I've dealt with more urgent matters," she answered, her tone bearing the refined accent of New Orleans gentry mixed with fresh authority. "And Ezra, send Clara to me right away." The elderly man's eyes revealed something resembling worry, yet he understood better than to challenge the lady of Belmont. "Certainly, madam," he whispered, lowering his head as he withdrew from the office. Meline went back to the mahogany desk that had previously been her husband Charles's property. Half a year had passed since yellow fever took him, leaving her to handle not merely the expansive plantation, but additionally their two sons, Philippe, age 22, and Henri, age 19. Both young men had acquired their father's delicate features and mild character, traits that benefited Charles well in the parlors of New Orleans, but demonstrated entirely insufficient for the brutal realities of plantation existence. The noise of light footsteps on the Persian rug signaled Clara's entrance. Meline glanced upward to see the young woman positioned in the entryway, her bearing straight despite the conditions of her enslavement. Clara was maybe 20 years old with complexion like coffee with cream and eyes containing complexities Meline found both captivating and disturbing. Unlike the other enslaved women on the property, Clara conducted herself with a peaceful self-respect that seemed nearly challenging, though she took care never to cross into open rebellion. "You requested my presence, Mrs. Darcy." Clara's tone was gentle yet distinct, educated, a consequence of having been brought up in the main house instead of the fields. Meline examined the young woman for an extended moment, her thoughts computing with the same exactness she used for harvest numbers and market values. Clara wore a plain gray dress that, despite its modesty, could not conceal her natural elegance. Her hair was neatly braided and secured, and her hands, though roughened from labor, were refined and expressive. "Clara," Meline began, standing from behind the desk to walk slowly around the space. "You have lived in this residence since childhood. You comprehend the delicate circumstances of our family's standing." "Indeed, madam," Clara replied, though her eyes showed a fatigue that Meline decided to overlook. "My sons," Meline continued, her tone acquiring a sharper quality, "are at a vital point in their maturation. They need direction in matters that I, being their mother, cannot offer. They must grasp the established hierarchy, the correct connection between owner and possession." Clara's hands tightened slightly at her sides, yet she stayed quiet. Meline stopped directly before the young woman, near enough to perceive the slight quiver in her breathing. "You will take care of their needs, Clara. Every one of their needs. You will instruct them about what it means to give orders, and you will discover what it means to submit without objection." The words remained suspended in the atmosphere like a sentence of death. Clara's calm expression never altered, yet something changed in her gaze, a glimpse of resolve that Meline misinterpreted as acceptance. "Do you grasp what I'm requesting of you?" Meline pressed, her tone decreasing to just above a murmur. "I understand completely, Mrs. Darcy," Clara answered, her voice so steady it was nearly melodic. "You desire me to assist your boys in becoming the men you think they need to be." Exactly. Meline smiled, a cold expression that failed to reach her eyes. You'll start this evening. Philippe will expect you in his quarters after supper. As Clara curtsied and turned to depart, Meline experienced a wave of contentment. She had resolved 2 issues with 1 choice.
You cannot escape
Her
this.
sons would
We had
acquire
no
the
choice.
ability to exercise
The circumstances
their
were
dominance,
dire.
and
You
Clara
chose
would
wrong.
be reminded of her position in the established hierarchy. What Meline neglected to recognize was that she had just ignited a fuse that would
Madam, I
eventually
bring
destroy
urgent
everything
news.
she valued.
What is it? There are whispers
The
of
remainder
rebellion.
of the day
I
passed
see.
in
We
a
must
blur of
act.
plantation matters. Meline consulted with the manager about the cotton collection, examined the household finances, and managed the dinner arrangements. But below her composed exterior, she found herself
My
reflecting
dear,
on
you must
Clara's
understand the
response,
gravity
or rather
of this
the absence
decision.
of one.
I do, but it feels
Most
so heavy on
enslaved
my
women would
heart.
have wept or pleaded. Clara had merely accepted her destiny with a composure that was somehow more unsettling than tears would have been. As night approached, Meline summoned her sons to the sitting room. Philippe and Henri Darcy were attractive young men, yet their handsomeness belonged to the fragile, almost soft type that had become popular among the Creole elite. Philippe, the older one, had inherited his mother's gray eyes and his father's sensitive lips. Henri was darker with auburn hair and a thoughtful look suggesting he occupied himself more with literature than practical affairs. "Mother," Philippe said as he entered the parlor, his voice containing the slight speech impediment that had remained since boyhood. "You wish to see us?" Meline gestured for them to sit on the silk-covered sofa while she continued standing, a stance that highlighted her dominance. "I've made preparations for your education to proceed in a more hands-on direction," she started, selecting her words thoughtfully. "Clara will be looking after your requirements from now on." Henri appeared puzzled. "Clara. But mother, she already helps with our laundry." "Not those kinds of requirements." Meline interrupted firmly. "You're grown men now, or you ought to be. It's time you discover how to exercise the authority that belongs to you by birth." Philippe's pale cheeks colored pink as comprehension hit. "Mother, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what you think I mean," Meline said decisively. "Your father was excessively gentle with you both. The wider world will not be so forgiving. You must learn to claim what is rightfully yours, to issue commands without hesitation or remorse." The 2 young men exchanged glances, a silent communication developed between them since childhood. Henri's romantic nature recoiled from the concept while Philippe struggled with the responsibilities placed upon him as the inheritor of Belmont. "What if we refuse?" Henri asked softly, his voice nearly inaudible. Meline's expression grew stern. "Then you will demonstrate yourselves unworthy of the Darcy name and everything your predecessors constructed. Clara is property, nothing more. If you cannot control a slave, how can you hope to control a plantation, a business, a wife?" The reasoning was harsh yet effective. Philippe straightened his shoulders, attempting to summon the authority his mother demanded. "Very well, mother. If this is what you consider necessary." Henri remained silent, yet the struggle in his dark eyes was apparent to anyone willing to observe. Meline, however, perceived only what she wished to perceive: compliance. As the evening progressed and dinner was presented in the magnificent dining room, Clara moved through her responsibilities with her typical quiet effectiveness. She served the soup course, replenished wine glasses, and cleared dishes, all while preserving the composed expression that had become her signature. Yet those who knew her well, Ezra, the cook Mammy Rose, and the other household slaves, observed subtle differences. Her movements were more purposeful, her quietness deeper, and something existed in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Following dinner, as the family withdrew to their individual rooms, Clara climbed the grand staircase toward Philippe's chamber. The corridor was dimly illuminated by oil lamps, casting flickering shadows on the walls decorated with portraits of Darcy forebears. Each painted countenance appeared to observe her progress with expressions of severe disapproval, as if aware of what was about to happen. She halted outside Philippe's door, her hand lifted to knock. For an instant the mask of composure slipped, exposing the young woman behind it, scared, angry, yet not defeated. Then she gathered herself, knocked softly, and entered when invited. Philippe stood near the window, still dressed in his evening attire but with his cravat loosened. He turned as she came in, and she could perceive the struggle written across his features, desire wrestling with conscience, authority fighting against his inherent gentleness. "Clara," he said softly, his voice uncertain. "My mother says that we're two." "I understand what your mother anticipates," Clara replied, closing the door behind her. "The question is, what do you anticipate, Mr. Philippe?" The inquiry hung between them like a dare. Philippe had been raised to give orders, yet he had also been raised to be a gentleman. The two demands seemed
You cannot
impossible to
escape
reconcile.
this.
We had no choice.
"I don't know,"
The circumstances
he
were
admitted,
dire.
his honesty
chose
surprising
wrong.
them both. "I don't wish to force." Clara moved nearer, her actions graceful
Madam,
and
I bring
purposeful.
urgent news. What is
"Your
it?
mother thinks that
There are
taking
whispers
what
of
you desire
rebellion.
will make
I
you
see, we
powerful,"
must
she
act.
said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yet maybe genuine power lies in deciding what you take and what you leave untouched." Philippe stared at her, perceiving not merely a beautiful slave, but an individual with
My
thoughts
dear,
and
you must
emotions as
understand the
intricate as his
gravity
own.
of this decision.
It was a
I do, but it
recognition
feels
that
so
would prove
heavy
more
on my
dangerous
heart.
to the established system than any act of rebellion. "What would you have me do?" he asked, the question revealing more vulnerability than he intended. Clara smiled then, an expression so tender and perceptive that it completely altered her appearance. "I would have you become the men you decide to be, not the men your mother commands." And as night deepened around Belmont Plantation, the initial seeds of transformation were planted. Meline Darcy rested peacefully in her bed, convinced she had protected her family's future through the exercise of complete authority. Yet in Philippe's chamber, a different type of instruction was commencing, one that would eventually challenge everything the Darcy dynasty represented. The existing order was about to encounter its ultimate trial, not from external pressures or financial strains, but from the quiet uprising of human awareness confronting its own moral conflicts. 3 weeks had passed since Meline's order, and the atmosphere at Belmont had changed in ways both slight and significant. Morning light filtered through the Spanish moss draped over the ancient oaks, casting dappled patterns across the plantation grounds where enslaved workers moved through their daily tasks with the mechanical precision born of generations in bondage. In the kitchen building, separated from the main residence by a covered walkway, Mammy Rose kneaded bread dough with more intensity than needed, her dark hands roughened by decades of service working the dough as if it were her frustrations made solid. At 63, she had witnessed 3 generations of Darcy's come and go, and she possessed the sharp insight that came from years of observing the White family's secrets while staying invisible to them. "That girl's playing with fire," she muttered to Ezra, who sat at the wooden table polishing silver. "Walking around here like she's got some kind of power over those boys." Ezra looked up from the candlestick he was buffing, his aged eyes reflecting decades of collected wisdom. "Maybe she does," he said quietly. "Maybe she's got the only power that counts, the power to make them see themselves clearly." "Hush your mouth," Mammy Rose hissed, glancing toward the entrance. "You know better than to speak such nonsense. That kind of thinking will get us all sold down the river." Yet even as she spoke, both servants understood that something essential had shifted in the household. Clara moved through her duties with the same quiet effectiveness as always, yet there was a fresh quality to her presence, a subtle self-assurance that appeared to radiate from within. She no longer avoided eye contact with family members, and when she spoke, her words carried a weight that demanded attention. In the main house, Meline sat in her morning room examining letters from her agent in New Orleans. Cotton prices remained stable, yet disturbing accounts of abolitionist activity increasing in the North reached her. She frowned while reading about slave uprisings in other states, making mental notes to strengthen security procedures at Belmont. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting to see one of the household servants. Instead, Philippe stepped into the room, his appearance disheveled in a manner that would have been scandalous in New Orleans society. His usually perfectly styled hair was disordered, his cravat untied, and dark circles beneath his eyes indicated sleepless nights. "Philippe," Meline said, putting down her correspondence. "You look dreadful. Are you unwell?" Her older son moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where Clara could be observed hanging laundry on the line. "I need to discuss Clara with you," he said without introduction. Meline's eyebrows lifted. "Oh. I trust she's been satisfactory in her duties." Philippe turned from the window, and Meline was startled by the intensity in his gray eyes. She's remarkable, he said simply. Intelligent, thoughtful, kind. Mother, did you realize she can read? Not just simple words, but actual literature. She's been teaching herself from the books in Father's library. That's quite enough. Meline said sharply, rising from her seat. I don't care about her accomplishments. She's property, Philippe. Nothing more. I hope you haven't forgotten that fundamental fact. How can I forget it when you constantly remind me? Philippe shot back, his voice containing an edge of defiance Meline had never heard before. But what if we're mistaken? What if the system we've built our lives upon is fundamentally wrong? The words hung in the atmosphere
You cannot
like
escape
heresy.
this.
We had no
Meline
choice.
stared at
The
her son as if
circumstances
he
were
had suddenly
dire.
You
developed
chose wrong.
horns. Philippe Darcy, you will not speak such treasonous nonsense in this household. Your father and grandfather
Madam,
built
I
this
bring urgent
plantation
news.
through hard
What
work
is
and
it?
proper
There are
understanding
whispers
of
of
the natural
rebellion.
hierarchy.
I see, we must act.
Negroes are children unable to govern themselves. It is our responsibility and our duty to give them structure and purpose. Is it? Philippe challenged. Or is it simply convenient for
My
us to
dear,
believe
you must
that?
understand the gravity of
Clara
this
speaks
decision.
3
I
languages,
do, but it feels
Mother.
so heavy on my heart.
She comprehends mathematics, philosophy, even music. How does that align with your theory of natural inferiority? Meline's face reddened with anger and something that might have been fear. You're being manipulated by a clever slave who knows exactly how to appeal to your softer nature. This is precisely why I arranged for her to attend to you, to teach you to master such misguided sympathies. The only thing she's taught me is that I've been living a falsehood, Philippe said quietly. We all have. Before Meline could respond, Henri appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. Mother, Philippe, I need to speak with both of you. It's about Clara. Meline's heart sank as she observed the same conflicted expression on Henri's face that had been troubling Philippe. What about her? Henri entered the room fully, closing the door behind him. Last night when she came to my chambers, we talked, truly talked. She told me about her family, how they were separated when she was 8 years old. Her mother was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, her father to one in Alabama. She hasn't seen them since. Henri, Meline warned, you're allowing yourself to be swayed by sob stories designed to. She wasn't trying to gain my sympathy, Henri interrupted, his voice stronger than usual. She was simply answering my questions. I asked about her life and she told me. Do you know what she said when I asked if she hated us? Meline and Philippe waited in tense silence. She said she couldn't afford to hate us because hatred would consume her soul, and her soul was the only thing she truly possessed. Then she asked me what I thought my soul was worth. The question seemed to reverberate in the elegant morning room, challenging the very foundations upon which the Darcy family had constructed their identity. Meline felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, yet she refused to acknowledge the earthquake her own actions had triggered. Enough, she said firmly. Both of you are allowing yourselves to be manipulated by a slave who is clearly more cunning than I gave her credit for. This ends immediately. Clara will be reassigned to field work right away. No, Philippe said, the word cutting through the air with surprising strength. Meline stared at her son in shock. I beg your pardon. I said no, Mother. You will not punish Clara for our awakening to truth. If you send her to the fields, I'll follow her there. And I'll join him, Henri added, moving to stand beside his brother. For the first time in her adult life, Meline Darcy found herself facing open rebellion from her own children. The irony was not lost on her. In attempting to teach them to master others, she had somehow lost mastery over them. You're both being ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. This infatuation will pass. Clara is a slave, and slaves exist to serve. That is the natural order of things. Whose nature? Philippe asked. Yours, mine, or the nature that created us all as human beings with equal souls. The philosophical challenge was more than Meline could bear. She had been raised in a world where such questions were never asked, where the hierarchy of race and class was as fixed as the movement of the stars. To question it was to question everything she had ever believed about herself and her place in the world. "Get out," she said quietly. "Both of you, get out of my sight before I say something I'll regret." The two young men exchanged glances and left the room, leaving Meline alone with her thoughts and her growing fear that the world she had known was crumbling around her. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters behind the main house, Clara sat on the steps of her small cabin, mending a tear in one of Henry's shirts. The irony of the task was not lost on her. She was literally repairing the fabric of her oppressor's life while simultaneously unraveling the fabric of his worldview. Mammy Rose approached, her heavy footsteps announcing her presence long before she spoke. "Child, you need to be careful. The mistress has that look in her eye, the one that means trouble for folks like us." Clara looked up from her sewing, her serene expression unchanged. "I know, Mammy Rose. But I can't unknow what I know now, and neither can they." "What you talking about, girl?" Clara set down the shirt and looked toward the main house, where she
You
could see
cannot
Philippe
escape
and Henri
this.
walking
We
in
had
the
no
garden,
choice.
deep in
The
conversation.
circumstances were dire.
You
"They're
chose
good
wrong.
men, Mammy Rose. Underneath all the poison they've been fed about who they're supposed to be, they're good men. And good men
Madam, I
can't
bring
live
urgent
with evil
news.
once they
What
truly
is it?
see it."
There are whispers of
"You
rebellion.
think you can
I
change
see.
them?"
We must act.
Mammy Rose asked skeptically. "Change the whole system with your pretty words and gentle ways?" "I don't think I can change anything," Clara replied honestly. "But I think they can change themselves
My
if they
dear,
choose
you must
to.
understand the gravity
And
of
that
this
choice,
decision.
that's where
I
real
do,
power
but it feels
lies."
so heavy on my heart.
As if summoned by their conversation, Philippe appeared at the edge of the slave quarters, his presence causing several of the enslaved workers to look up in surprise. It was unusual for the young master to venture into their domain. "Clara," he called softly. "Might I speak with you?" She rose gracefully, aware of the eyes upon them both. "Of course, Mr. Philippe." They walked together toward the old oak tree that stood at the boundary between the slave quarters and the main grounds, its massive trunk scarred by decades of storms but still standing strong. "I've been thinking about what you said," Philippe began, his voice uncertain. "About choosing what kind of man I want to be." "And what have you decided?" Clara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Philippe stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I've decided that I don't want to be the kind of man who owns other human beings. I don't want to inherit a fortune built on suffering. I want to be better than that." Clara studied his face, seeing the sincerity there, but also the fear. "That's a dangerous decision, Mr. Philippe. Your mother won't understand. Your neighbors will shun you. You'll lose everything you've been raised to expect." "Will I?" Philippe asked. "Or will I finally gain something worth having? A clear conscience and the respect of people whose opinions actually matter." Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the main drive at a gallop, dust clouds marking his urgent passage. Philippe and Clara hurried toward the main house, arriving just as the rider dismounted. It was James Beauregard, the plantation overseer, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Mrs. Darcy," he called as he bounded up the front steps. "Mrs. Darcy, you need to hear this." Meline appeared on the veranda, her face composed despite the morning's emotional turmoil. "What is it, Mr. Beauregard?" "News from New Orleans, ma'am. There's been another slave uprising in Virginia. Nat Turner's rebellion has inspired others. The authorities are cracking down hard, but there's talk of abolitionists helping slaves escape to the north." Meline's face paled. "How close is this unrest?" "Hard to say, ma'am, but the word is spreading. Some of the plantation owners are talking about selling off their most intelligent slaves, the ones who might cause trouble." Philippe felt Clara tense beside him, though her expression remained carefully neutral. The implication was clear. Slaves like Clara, who could read and think and inspire others, were now seen as particularly dangerous. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Beauregard," Meline said. "Please increase the patrols and make sure all the slaves are accounted for at night." As the overseer rode away, Meline's gaze fell upon Philippe and Clara standing together beneath the oak tree. The sight filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with distant rebellions and everything to do with the revolution taking place within her own family. The battle lines were being drawn, and Meline Darcy was beginning to realize that the enemy might not be outside agitators or rebellious slaves, but the very conscience she had tried so hard to suppress in her own sons. The second act of this drama was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than anyone yet realized. The humid Louisiana air hung heavy with the promise of a storm as August drew to a close. For 6 weeks now, the delicate balance at Belmont Plantation had been shifting like sand beneath the tide, and Meline Darcy could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. She stood in her late husband's study, now permanently hers, staring at the letter that had arrived that morning from her brother-in-law in New Orleans. The news it contained was both expected and devastating. Rumors of the Darcy sons' peculiar sympathies had reached the ears of New Orleans society. Invitations were being quietly withdrawn. Business partnerships questioned. And the family's reputation, built over 3 generations, was hanging by a thread. "Damn them both," she whispered, crumpling the letter in her fist. "Damn their weak hearts and their father's gentle blood." A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Come," she called, expecting Ezra with the afternoon meal. Instead, Clara entered the room, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. Meline's eyes narrowed as she
You
studied the
cannot
young
escape
woman who had
this.
become the
We had no
unwitting
choice.
catalyst for her
The
family's
circumstances
destruction.
were dire.
You chose
Clara
wrong.
moved with the same quiet grace as always, but there was something different about her now, a subtle confidence that seemed to radiate from within.
Madam, I bring
"I
urgent
didn't
news.
request tea,"
What is it?
Meline said
There are
coldly.
whispers of rebellion.
I see.
"No,
We must
ma'am,"
act.
Clara replied, setting the tray on the mahogany desk. "But I thought you might need it. You've seemed troubled lately." The audacity of the statement took Meline's breath away. "Troubled?"
My dear, you must understand the
I'm troubled?
gravity of this decision.
Her voice
I
rose
do,
with
but it
each
feels so
word.
heavy on my heart.
"You've destroyed my family, turned my sons against everything they were raised to believe, and you think I'm merely troubled." Clara poured the tea with steady hands, her serene expression never wavering. "I haven't destroyed anything, Mrs. Darcy. I've simply existed as myself. If that existence has caused problems, perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with a system that requires people to deny their own humanity." Meline's hand moved instinctively toward the small pistol she kept in the desk drawer, a lady's weapon, pearl-handled and deadly. "How dare you speak to me that way? How dare you stand in my husband's study and lecture me about humanity?" "Because someone must," Clara said quietly, meeting Meline's furious gaze without flinching. "And because your sons have found the courage to question what they've been taught, even if you haven't." The words hit Meline like physical blows. She had spent months trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong, how her simple plan to toughen her sons had instead awakened their consciences. Now looking at Clara's calm face, she finally understood the truth she had been avoiding. The problem wasn't that Clara was too clever or manipulative. The problem was that she was undeniably, unmistakably human. "You think you've won," Meline said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you've turned my boys against me with your pretty words and your tragic stories. But you've forgotten something crucial, Clara. You're still my property. You still belong to me." "Do I?" Clara asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or do I belong to myself as God intended? Your sons have begun to see the truth, Mrs. Darcy. The question is whether you're brave enough to see it, too." Before Meline could respond, the study door burst open, and Philippe rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and determination. Henri followed close behind, both young men clearly agitated. "Mother," Philippe said breathlessly. "We need to talk. Henri and I have made a decision." Meline's heart sank as she saw the resolution in her sons' faces. "What decision?" Henri stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by surprising steel. "We're freeing the slaves, Mother. All of them. We're going to sell the plantation and use the proceeds to help them establish new lives as free people." The words hit Meline like a physical blow. She staggered backward, gripping the edge of the desk for support. "You can't be serious. You can't simply. This plantation has been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather built this empire from nothing. Built it on the backs of stolen people," Philippe said firmly. "Built it on a foundation of human misery. We won't be part of that anymore." Meline's gaze swung wildly between her sons and Clara, who stood quietly beside the tea service, her expression unreadable. "This is her doing," she said, pointing an accusatory finger. "She's poisoned your minds with abolitionist propaganda." "Clara has never spoken against slavery," Henri said quietly. "She's never had to. Her very existence is argument enough against the system that enslaves her." "Your children," Meline spat, "naive children who don't understand the realities of the world. Without slavery, the South's economy would collapse. Thousands of white families would be ruined. The Negroes themselves would starve without our guidance and protection." Philippe shook his head sadly. "Listen to yourself, mother. You're so convinced of your own righteousness that you can't see the evil right in front of you. We're not protecting anyone. We're perpetuating a system of cruelty that degrades everyone it touches, including us." Meline felt the last of her control slipping away. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in was crumbling before her eyes. In desperation, she pulled the pistol from the desk drawer, pointing it directly at Clara. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "All of you, get out. Clara, you have until sunset to leave this plantation. If I see you after dark, I'll shoot you as a runaway slave." Philippe stepped protectively in front of Clara, his face pale but determined. "If you want to shoot her, you'll have to shoot me first." Henri moved to
You
stand
cannot
beside his
escape
brother,
this.
presenting
We
a
had no
united
choice.
front.
The circumstances were
And
dire.
me.
You chose wrong.
Meline stared at her sons, these young men she had raised, loved, and tried to mold in her own image, and saw strangers.
Madam, I bring urgent
They were
news.
willing to die
What
for
is
a
it?
slave,
There are
willing to
whispers of
throw away
rebellion.
their birthright
see,
for the
we
sake
must
of an
act.
ideal she couldn't understand. "You're not my sons," she whispered, the pistol wavering in her trembling hand. "My sons would never betray their own blood for a Negro." "We're exactly your sons," Philippe
My dear,
said
you must
gently.
understand the gravity
"We're
of
the
this
men
decision.
you raised us to be,
I do,
even
but
if
it
we're
feels
not
so
the men
heavy
you
on my
wanted us to
heart.
become. Father taught us to be kind, to be just, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. We're honoring his memory, even if we're disappointing you." The mention of Charles broke something inside Meline. She lowered the pistol, her shoulders sagging with defeat. "Your father was a good man," she admitted quietly. "Too good for this world, perhaps. Too good for me." Clara stepped out from behind Philippe, her movement slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Darcy," she said softly. "It's not too late. You could choose to be the woman your husband believed you were. You could choose to see us as he saw us, as people worthy of freedom and dignity." For a moment, Meline wavered. She looked at Clara's face, really looked at it, and saw not a piece of property, but a young woman with hopes and dreams and fears just like her own. She saw intelligence and kindness and a strength that had endured years of bondage without breaking. But the moment passed. The weight of a lifetime's conditioning, the fear of losing everything she had known, the terror of admitting she had been wrong about something so fundamental. It was too much. "No," she said, her voice hollow. "I can't. I won't. This is my home, my life, my world. I won't let you destroy it." Philippe and Henri exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Then we'll leave," Philippe said simply. "Tonight. All of us." "You can't," Meline protested. "You're my heirs. This plantation will be yours someday." "We don't want it," Henri said firmly. "We'll make our own way in the world with clean hands and clear consciences." And as the three young people turned to leave, Meline called out desperately, "Where will you go? What will you do? You have no money, no connections outside of Louisiana society." Philippe paused at the door. "We'll go north to the Free States. We'll work. We'll build new lives. And we'll help others do the same. You'll be outcasts," Meline warned. "Pariahs. No decent society will accept you." Clara spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "Perhaps it's time to find a new definition of decent society, Mrs. Darcy. One based on character rather than color, on humanity rather than hierarchy." As they left the study, Meline sank into her husband's chair, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the plantation continuing its daily routine, slaves working in the fields, overseers calling out orders, the eternal cycle of oppression and resistance that had defined her world for as long as she could remember. But now that world felt hollow, empty of meaning. Her sons were gone, not just physically, but spiritually. They had chosen a different path, one that led away from everything she had taught them to value. As the sun began to set over the Louisiana Delta, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Meline Darcy sat alone in her empty mansion, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and the weight of her choices. She had tried to preserve her world by hardening her sons' hearts. But instead, she had lost them to the very compassion she had sought to destroy. The old order was dying, and she was its last lonely guardian. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening when Philippe, Henri, and Clara had disappeared into the Louisiana night, leaving Belmont Plantation forever changed. The winter of 1848 had been harsh, not just in terms of weather, but in the cold reality of consequences that had settled over the once grand estate like a shroud. Meline Darcy stood at the same window where she had first conceived her terrible plan. But the woman who gazed out at the frost-covered fields bore little resemblance to the iron-willed widow of months past. Her raven hair had gone prematurely gray. Her face was gone from sleepless nights and poor appetite, and her once proud bearing had given way to a stooped posture that spoke of defeat. The plantation was dying. Without her sons to inherit it, and with the scandal of their abolitionist sympathies having spread throughout Louisiana society, Meline found herself increasingly isolated. Business partners had withdrawn their support. Neighboring plantation owners avoided her, and even the slaves seemed to sense the change in the air, working
You
with
cannot
less
escape
enthusiasm,
this.
whispering
We had no
among
choice.
themselves about
The
freedom
circumstances
in
were
the
dire.
You chose wrong.
Ezra entered the study, carrying the morning mail, his aged hands trembling more than usual. At 70, he had served the
Madam,
Darcy
I bring
family
urgent
his
news.
entire life,
What is it?
and the
There are
uncertainty of
whispers
the
of rebellion.
plantation's future
I see.
weighed
We
heavily
must
on his
act.
mind. Any word? Meline asked without turning from the window, though they both knew what she was asking about. No, ma'am, Ezra replied softly. No letters from the young
My
masters.
dear, you must understand the gravity
Meline
of this
nodded,
decision.
unsurprised
I
but
do,
still
but it feels so
disappointed.
heavy on my heart.
She had written dozens of letters to Philippe and Henri, sending them to every major city in the north, but had received no replies. It was as if her sons had vanished from the earth, taking Clara with them into a world she couldn't understand or follow. There is something else, though, Ezra continued hesitantly. A visitor. Says he's from the bank in New Orleans. Meline's heart sank. She had been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since the cotton crop had failed to meet its projected yields and the plantation's debts had begun to mount. Send him in, she said, finally turning from the window to face whatever news awaited her. The banker was a thin, nervous man named Thibodeau, who had clearly drawn the short straw when it came to delivering bad news to desperate plantation owners. He clutched his hat in his hands as he entered the study, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. Mrs. Darcy, he began, his voice apologetic but firm. I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding your accounts. How much time do I have? Meline asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Thibodeau blinked in surprise at her directness. Well, that is to say, the bank is prepared to extend your credit for another 3 months, provided you can demonstrate a clear plan for repayment. And if I can't? Then I'm afraid we'll have no choice but to foreclose on the property. The plantation would be sold at auction to satisfy your debts. Meline nodded slowly, having expected as much. And the slaves? They would be sold as well, of course. Separately, most likely, to maximize the return for creditors. The words hit Meline like a physical blow. She thought of Ezra, who had served her family faithfully for 7 decades, of Mammy Rose, who had nursed her sons through childhood illnesses, of the field hands who had worked the Darcy land for generations. They would all be scattered to the winds, families separated, lives destroyed. For the first time since her sons had left, Meline truly understood what Philippe and Henri had been trying to tell her. The system she had defended so fiercely was not just morally wrong. It was also inherently unstable, built on a foundation of human misery that could collapse at any moment. After the banker left, Meline sat alone in the study, staring at the portrait of her late husband that hung above the fireplace. Charles Darcy gazed down at her with kind eyes, and she found herself wondering what he would have done in her situation. You always were too gentle for this world, she whispered to the painting. But perhaps that was your strength, not your weakness. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Come, she called, expecting Ezra. Instead, Mammy Rose entered the room, her massive frame filling the doorway. The elderly cook had never before entered the master's study uninvited, and her presence here now spoke to the extraordinary circumstances they all faced. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Darcy, Mammy Rose said, her voice respectful but determined. But I heard about the banker's visit. The whole quarters is talking about what's going to happen to us. Meline looked at the woman who had been a constant presence in her life for over 20 years. I'm sorry.